Hi, I'm Richard Henrich, Artistic Director of Spooky Action Theater, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our discussion today about writing in the time of COVID-19. When theaters closed last March, we immediately turned to our New Works in Action program of new play development, plan readings of new plays online. Happily, 4 of our New Works playwrights agreed to let us present their work as live stream readings instead of in the theater as we originally planned. Presenting these readings over the last several weeks has been an exciting experiment for us. Joining us today is Gillian Drake, our New Works in Action Program Director. Gillian will introduce you to our playwrights and lead a conversation to explore the challenges and opportunities we're now discovering in creating virtual theater online. Our first playwright is Kevin Kautzman, who wrote Moderation for us. I'm inviting Kevin to step in. There's
hey, everyone.
Kevin.
Hello.
And the second playwright is Matthew Kelly, who wrote We Victorians, which was an extravaganza never to be forgotten. Third playwright, Laura Shamus, who wrote Circular, a beautiful, beautiful play that combined mythology and present-day events. And Jack Novak, who is a Washington resident, did Transferal, who took us beyond the present into the afterlife and back. So what more could you ask? What I'm going to do now is duck out myself and turn it over to Gillian, who will lead the conversation. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
So, what is the role or purpose of theater in a time of global pandemic, widespread unemployment, national protests, roller coaster economy, and no common meeting places open to more than a handful of people? The Wall Street Journal had a headline today that said 6 months that shocked the world. And one of the questions is this an inspiration or a gut punch? Is it an obstacle or an opportunity? The level of upheaval is it is unprecedented here since the 30s. So it's 12 million unemployed, 21 million unemployed, 19 million salaried positions gone, 140,000 businesses not reopened after closing in March. 1,700 cities and towns have had demonstrations against police brutality against our Black citizens across all 50 states. There's just a phenomenal amount, and 3.2% of our senior executive positions are held by Black people, who are 13.5% of the population. So with this upheaval which is clearly broader than a quarantine, and shutting theaters and protests, I wondered is this a time ripe for playwrights to find inspiration and complex representation of what's going on? That's my first question to any one of you. Is it a great time, or is it a time in which we find ourselves frozen? How about Laura?
I will speak personally first, and then I will try and branch it out a little bit more. Personally, I have been frozen. I have not written any new words since the pandemic began. And I have found myself to be concerned on a daily basis about the well-being of those whom I love, and those around me, and people I know, and just absolutely consumed with that, and fearful all the time, and thinking about the future of everyone's lives. And so no, for me personally, it hasn't been a time of prolific writing. I will say this though, I have had great sustenance from theater companies who have had Zooms and Zoom meetings, just not even producing things, but the Native Voices Zoom meetings, which of their associated playwrights, which we have had every other week. I mean, just seeing so many talented people on a Zoom on a regular basis has been meaningful to me, and I almost cry at the end of it every time. I feel like crying seeing these playwrights today, and I haven't even met them in person before, but hello, you guys, I feel like crying seeing you. Anyway, in all good ways. So, you know, altar theater has also been sustaining to me. I've had a couple of Zooms with them, just talking with other artists about what's going on. And, you know, Transformation Theater in DC has also been sustaining to me in terms of Zooms and a commission I'm working on for them. So, which is going to force me to write here real soon. So I would just say, now branching it out from me, I think it's been a time of pause. That's what I see, where people have been forced to reflect, you know, who am I? What does this mean? What would be important to me in life going forward? How am I going to, not just artistically, but in every way, what is going to change for me now that this has happened? And can we get, you know, people don't want to go back to the normal in many ways. I mean, talking about the social revolutions that we hope for change to bring and things like that. We want there to be something better on the other end of it. But anyway, that's how I will finish. It's been a time of great reflection for me, and I would say writing in action.
Great. Matt?
Yeah, no, I echo a lot of that. I think that I've done some writing. I've had to do some writing. I had a production that was supposed to happen in Ireland that was changed to like a Zoom festival. And so I had to write something new for that, which actually was quite lovely. But it's a difficult time, I think. It's a difficult time across all domains. I mean, I feel like, you know, in some ways it's a matter of gaining some perspective. And we are in the middle of the crucible. I think we are sitting in the midst of a crucible, and not to mix metaphors, but there are storms. I mean, there are so many different storms all around us, and they're all monumental and momentous. And we're trying to understand how best to find our way through them and to be guided by them and towards something better than where we are now, because where we are now is not a good place. And I think we can all agree that where we are now and where we were was not a good place. And so as writers, you try to write toward what that future can be or should be. And we're still in that storm. And so I think for those reasons, it's, you know, taking a pause and trying to understand those winds. I'm trying to understand, really. I mean, I'm in a learning phase, right? And I'm learning a lot. And part of that learning is just about not writing and not talking.
Right, taking it in, taking it in. Yeah.
The last thing, yeah, right, exactly. I mean, we need to be informed. And so I'm being informed by all different sorts of voices, all different sorts of people, all different sorts of stories, and you know, really I think becoming a better person because of it. And then my hope is to become a better writer because I've become a better person because I listened. And so
that's really a great point, right? That this is a big, huge learning opportunity. And as artists, we have to take it in and process it and how does it affect us and how does it give us a voice later after this? I mean, that's what news cycles do is respond to the moment, and opinion writers, and that's not what we are. So Jack, what about you? How does this, is it an opportunity or a frozen moment?
Yeah, well, I think, interestingly for me personally, I've actually happened to be very creative during the pandemic. And I think a lot of that has been because, you know, I lost almost all my work. And so I just was focusing on writing. I also started a low residency MFA program in writing right at the beginning of the pandemic. And so because of that, I've also had to keep writing. So that's part of it. So I've found it very creative for myself, but I think, and I really strongly echo what I think Laura was saying about how it's a time for reflection, because I mean, literally everybody having to step back from the work is forcing us to rethink how it's being done. And also, I mean, financially, theaters are going to have to completely restructure and rethink about how their work is being done. And I think, I think I'm going to offer what might be a controversial opinion, which is that there's no such thing as theater on Zoom. I think that theater artists can create stuff on Zoom or digitally, but I think that that's film or television. It's not actually theater. To me, a live space does not count. Like a digital live space does not count as a live space for how I define theater. So I think that, you know, we can continue to create stuff on Zoom, and I think that that's great. I think theater artists turning their eyes towards, you know, creating in lots of different ways is fantastic. But I think if we're talking about creating theater, you know, truly in the sense of what theater is meant to be, which is a live connection between people, I think we have to be more creative. And I was trying to find it, but I was through my MFA program, I was talking to the playwright Sheila Callahan, who brought up this play that Brandon Jacobs Jenkins wrote. I think was featured on a podcast, and I couldn't find exactly where it was, but she was talking about how this play that Brandon Jacobs Jenkins wrote is for two people living in quarantine together to do with each other. So each person who's participating basically they play an audio track, two different audio tracks at the same time, and they are basically fed their lines and their subtext, and they speak to each other, but they don't hear what the other person's script is until they say it. So it's like a play where you are both audience and performer.
Yes.
And that is like an interesting creative way to actually create theater to me, because there are live audience and performer in a live shared space. And so I think that what will be interesting for us is reflecting so that when we come back to theater as usual, it won't be so as usual anymore. But I also think that theater artists will continue to find really interesting things to do, either using different mediums, right, digital mediums or whatever, or finding really interesting creative ways to start finding ways to connect in live spaces again. And I think that like probably that will look like a lot more intimate theater experiences, right, where just very tiny groups of people somehow in a shared space, sharing intimate performance with each other. Or something along those lines. I don't know, but I think there are some interesting possibilities. I think there'll be some interesting discoveries made through the process. So
that's true. Yep. And we're already seeing that. And if you look at like Bard School College, their student theater channel is full of amalgams of Zoom and other. They're creating for this particular format and other formats, and they go in and out of video and not video. It's quite the next generation already has this in some fashion. But Kevin, what do you have? Where are you right now in this process?
Yeah, hello everyone. Thanks for creating the platform to have this discussion. So I've had quite a wild year. My fiance and I last December determined to leave New York City to come to the Twin Cities. So we've had a very theatrical year personally. And I have a couple of thoughts about this. First, I am doing some writing. I have a screenwriting partner who lives in London, who's a film director. Obviously, that's not theater, but there is something kind of sweet and simple about just having 4 to 6 hours set aside with a partner to do a little collaborative writing. It keeps us honest. Obviously, I don't do playwriting that way. I write plays myself individually. I write a new play every year, almost without exception. So the big challenge for me, echoing what was said before, is around the processing of what's happening and how to know where to turn my binoculars right now. Is very difficult to know what to write about. What is the subject? Because so much of the war of playwriting is won or lost based on what you determine at the outset matters. So I'm in this processing phase around deciding what I need to say and what I have to offer in the broader conversation. So it's definitely a processing place. But at some point this year, I will chunk 2 to 3 weeks, long hours, and I'm just going to go into my hidey hole and hopefully come back with a script that has some relevance. Regarding the time of the plague, I've always been very interested in the ideas of Artaud, and he very explicitly writes about theater needing to be as a plague, needing to be intense. And I think I'll probably revisit it. This conversation has prompted me to pull up a PDF copy of The Theater and Its Double, and it's the first essay. It's The Theater and the Plague. And then the final thing I'll offer on this right now is that American theater artists have a unique challenge right now, but also generally, because our culture has become theatrical, highly, highly theatrical, fractal. Consensus reality has eroded, and who's more theatrical than the clown in chief? When we come back, we have to contend with the reality that America is in many ways a circus that never stops. The popular culture is a circus that never stops. Attention spans are absolutely minuscule. They've been architected to be that way. So we have a unique challenge ahead of us, but a lot of opportunity, because I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of hunger for localism, for immediate experience, for bodies in space, and all the things that we know how to do better than anyone else. And I'm just excited for that. So
that's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Those are great first thoughts. But you brought up the past. So I did want to ask about theater in the role of theater it's played in past pandemics. And if we want to, because this isn't the first time that it's shut down the theaters, and maybe there's something we can learn from the past. So I know I was going to ask this of Matt about what does history tell us?
Sure. Yeah. I think that, a great deal of theater has been written during times of plague. I kind of, if you go, far back, some of our most famous theater, Shakespeare lived during the times of the bubonic plague, right? In his most prolific years, for over 60% of the time, the globe was closed due to quarantine. Right. So nobody really thinks about that, but his theater was closed over 60% of the decade of the time when he was writing a lot of his work. And so he spent a lot of time at home, living across the street from a church that was constantly ringing the bells of the dead. Right. And so when you think about the effects that this has on him as a writer, and what's also fascinating is that he doesn't really have any plays that are like, this is the plague play. Right. He uses metaphor. He occasionally would use it, in Romeo and Juliet, the friar doesn't get to Romeo to deliver the letter because of the plague. Right. It's sometimes a plot element, but it's never, this is my plague play. And then he eventually escaped and went on tour, and he toured to other parts of the country that didn't have the plague, and he got bored. And he started to write and collaborate with other writers. And so a lot of the plays, and then eventually, when they thought it was safe, they moved into smaller theaters. Right, they didn't go into the Globe, and that period of smaller theater was done by candlelight, and that's when we got a lot of his more intimate plays. Right, and so that's sort of what historians have pieced together about how the plague has affected Shakespeare. And then if you jump ahead, like social upheaval in the modern day, you have the AIDS pandemic, which was the period of history that I studied. So my background is in playwriting and history, and that's an era that I think is perhaps even more relevant to look at, because it was a time of incredible social upheaval. It was a time when theater was used both to educate and to express emotion, for basically the coming out of rage and grief by a community that previously was not seen. And it was also a time of negligence, of widespread governmental negligence. That, the Reagan administration, was criminally negligent in the age.
And 35 million people died worldwide from that epidemic. 35 million.
And so, in the 80s and 90s, we had a number of pieces of theater that came out. I think we could learn a great deal from them. There were also, to look at where we are now, there were also pieces of theater that were largely written from a similar voice, right? There were a lot of stories of gay white characters. which is a problem, something that I think we're starting to understand a little bit more. But the voices of empowerment were important. And now we're starting to see more discussion of that era as a period of history in theater. And we had the Normal Heart redone, restaged and things like that. So I do think that, we can learn something from these periods, but I mean, we can't just replicate those lessons because, I think this is a period of multiple movements colliding.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is, where do we go with these multiple movements colliding, and how do we create theater that responds in a way that is not just the way the theater has responded in the past?
Yeah, it's a big subject, right? Because it's true. It's not about just one thing. It's this big upheaval, which we haven't seen. Well, in the 60s, there was a lot of things going on, and that created an incredibly creative period of the 70s and the 80s. So with this in mind, this idea that
Wait, I wanted to say something.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see your hand.
That's
Yes.
okay. I've been waving. Thank you, Matthew. That was so great. And I'm going to just throw in a couple of things additionally. Shakespeare was able to do that because his patron was King James, at least for the second part. So, he got additional funding. I'm really trying to, their theater wasn't based on box office at that point. So that's another thing and also there's some people who theorize that it was during the first plague, or not the first plague, because they had a series of plagues, but the 1593 plague, that Shakespeare first turned to writing poetry. That in fact, that the pandemic brought dramatic writers to write other things, which I think is relevant to today. And then I read this very interesting article on American theater called Theater in the Last Pandemic by Charlotte Canning. And she made this point, which I thought was really interesting. And it goes to Matthew's point about, did Shakespeare ever write a plague play? No, but he did write references to it through many works. And she noted that there were literary figures in America who were alive during the 1918 plague, either as children or adults, who never ever wrote about it. Like Eugene O'Neill, Lillian Hellman, Clifford Odets, Zora Neale Hurston, Susan Glassell, Arthur Miller, Tennessee Williams. I mean, it's just interesting that they never wrote one work that was about that, and she pointed that out. So anyway, that's the thing that I was going to say about the future, though, and I guess that's our final question. Maybe you don't want me to jump it, but I think that there are pros and cons to using the past as a blueprint for the future here. I mean, what Matthew was saying about social revolutions and this time period are true. But I also think that during the time of, let's say, 1918 and also Shakespeare's time, theater was the main form of dramatic literature. But now we have a lot more forms. We have radio, TV, film, and now Zoom plays. I mean, we just have a lot. I think it's a little bit different. So when we get to the future part of this, I'll be very interested to hear what other people think of that. To me, it goes to the question of what's the purpose of theater? And if the purpose of theater is community, to build a temporary community, because I think every audience is a temporary community. When you have a temporary community and you're going to laugh and cry together as we experience what it means to be human, then is that possible in a digital world? I don't know. I've been interested to hear everyone else on that eventually.
Well, we can follow that along. I know Jack had already sort of talked about what is theater and is being separated theater. But so we're also thinking that we're never going to get back together. But of course, we are going to get back together. There is most likely going to be a vaccine. It might not be December, but we'll most likely have a vaccine, and we'll most likely get to vaccinate, it really, I understand, the entire world, which will take a process. So maybe it's 2 years from now that there is a vaccine and people feel comfortable getting into crowds and going into the theater again. So I don't think I don't think it's the end of time, but it might be a very beginning of this, since this challenge has set us apart. Maybe after a year or two of being apart, this will create an inspiration of some kind of need, a new need to have theater which builds community in a room with each other. It also reminds me that 2 years is about the average time it takes to start the idea of a play, write it, go through the readings back and forth and developments. And at the end of 2 years is usually when plays, often it's between 1 year and 3, are ready for production. So like for some main stage large place. So in some ways, we have 2 years. That is the amount of time that people are predicting before things are really back to normal, as they say. This idea of, so at the moment, are you, so that we had already talked about, are you writing for the moment or are you writing for later? And if it's made you stop what you're working on and change course. And some of you already talked about that, but can we talk about, this, I think about this idea of developing your plays. So we know if it's not 2 years before we're actually all in a room together, maybe it's 1.5 years, but we're not in a room together. How do you guys see, you can have good ideas, you can start writing, but isn't your writing for theater means you have to have this back and forth with your actors and directors and your audience? What does that mean for the next 2 years, and how has it displaced you? How does it change your process? Sorry, that was so long, but I got to it eventually. Who wants to talk? Kevin, your process.
Hello.
Hi.
My process, there was a loud bang and all of the internet went out. So I'm on my phone now, which is okay. But, my initial response to that is that I think we'd be in denial if we said it wasn't going to set us back a little bit. You have to accept that we're going to lose. We are going to miss a beat. But, energy has a way of flowing, not to sound too woo-woo there, but it's like a spring, right? Or steam. And I feel like there's steam gathering and there's energy, and the trick is not to let it destroy you, not to let it make you cynical or too fearful, I think, over time. And I have to say, my play was probably fairly well suited for the format. I do tend to write about technology, not all the time. Maybe I should write about it more.
Yeah, you could adapt this with just a little tiny, the moderation could have been adapted for Zoom quite specifically. And yeah, you'd be produced all over the country.
Well, I mean, that's all right. I feel like I did get a lot out of this process, but it's a little sad because I had turned my attention to some other, a little more to screenwriting. I focused on starting a business, in tech, web development and all that. And I'd been living in New York and I was like, okay, I'm really going to get back into the theater and I'm going to go and I can't wait. And, and I've had commissions and I've had productions and I've just loved that feeling. What's better than that first day, whether it's a workshop reading or even better, a production, everyone gets in the room, you open up those books and you're off. And if you're the playwright in the room and you've got time, you can tear a page out and put a new page in, and the actors look at you like, this is terrifying but great. And what's better than all of that? There's just nothing comparable to that. And yet I do think that it does behoove us in organizations like this. I think in the meantime, yes, let's continue to do this. These readings are just invaluable. I have a whole new set of notes from this one reading that I'm going to bring to the next draft. And if we hadn't done this, I wouldn't have them. So
good.
That's my 2 cents.
I'm so glad to hear that. So they are useful. I do want to talk about how useful in the next little section. But I'm glad to hear it. About this comment about how it's changed or developed. Go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that this might be a tangential response to it, but for me, it's when I think about writing now. One of the biggest challenges is that writing, I think, is an idealized adventure, right? Where you're trying to create a world, and then you're trying to figure out how it exists in our world. And so it's our play worlds in dialogue with the real world. And right now, I think, going back to the idea of learning, we're learning a lot about our real world and our audiences, right? And it's not pretty, right? I mean, we as a country are not sitting at a time where we can imagine this idealized audience that's going to sit and take in and be on the same page as us and clap their hands. And instead, we're coming to learn that our country, our audience, is fractured in these deep, deep ways. So how do I, as a playwright, sit down and think, basically, am I just going to write for one segment of the audience? Am I just going to write for people who have disposable income, who are liberal, who come to theaters and laugh at my jokes and clap and then go home not having been changed at all, right? Or am I going to try to write across the community? And that's really hard to do right now, right? When you're living at a time of intense fracturing. I mean, so when my process is, who is the audience, right? And right now, my eyes are wide open and saying, my gosh, this is the audience. And the audience is divided in a way that I can't remember ever writing with the knowledge that the audience was as divided as it is now. And so, I mean, I honestly, right now, as opposed to writing, I found it to be more useful to actually like engage, through Facebook and things like that with people in the extended community who express views that are really hard for me to reconcile, and to have dialogue, right? That's opened my eyes. That's not playwriting. That's just having a dialogue. That's literally me writing. Me, Matt, is saying the following things, right? And trying to understand where people are, and trying to understand where my voice can be useful. Because I just think the last thing the world needs is me sitting down writing a play about just some random idea that I come up with and then trying to pitch it to a theater because, why not? I'm a playwright. I just think that's not this moment. This moment is bigger than that. And so that's why my process, a wrench has been thrown into my process, but I think it's probably the most useful kind of wrench, because realistically, it's not like these problems are new. It's just we're being exposed to them. And so now we're thinking about them. And I think it's going to change things. I really hope it does, because I don't want to go see a play in 2.5 years that's, I don't know, some like jukebox musical about the 1940s or 1960s. I want to see something more meaningful. And I want to write something more meaningful. I don't know how to do that yet, and I'm still learning.
Right. Yeah. How about Jack? Jack?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a weird time for me because, like I said, I've just started this MFA program, which is a low residency program. So I was already intending for it to be long distance for the most part. So that was sort of already what I was expecting to be, how I was expecting to be collaborating this year.
But Matthew brings up a really interesting point, which is, has this moment made us rethink our audience and who's included in our audience? And can we write for the whole fractured audience? Has it made it less possible to talk across or include more, or less possible? Are we only going to be able to reach our own little set of people? So that's so what do you think?
No, I think that's really right. I think that's a big part of the reflection that is going on in this time, as Laura mentioned way back at the beginning, that like we're all reflecting on where theater fits into the world, and we're in a time where we have a lot of time to think and examine. We are finding all the ways that the theater community is complicit in a racially biased world and an economically biased world, and the way that as much as we think that we're like on the progressive side of the country, we have many failures, and I think it's also the fact has to be mentioned that we are a mostly white group of theater artists here talking about this, and so clearly there's work to be done amongst us.
And just to throw in, and also gender bias.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think all of those things are things that we should be keeping in mind as we're thinking about what theater needs to be when we come back to it. And interestingly, you know, as I've been thinking about theater and this is sort of as a tangent, but you know, there is such a thing as activist theater, right? And I mean, I think that although
it's not really spooky, we're not exactly activist theater.
Right, exactly. But like, I think, you know, there was an article that came out on HowlRound when Trump was elected that posited that the time for nuance in theater is dead, which I don't agree with. I don't really ascribe to that, but I do think that there is a place for theater that is overtly activist theater. I mean, if you think about like Bread and Puppet theater and what they have done in conjunction with protests. And I think that, you know, there is theater happening in our city right now. Like when protesters march onto the highway and lie down on the asphalt for 8 minutes and 37 seconds, that is extremely powerful theater, you know? That is maybe, you know, the people who organize that might not call it theater, but it is. I mean, at its most essential. I'm like, if we're talking about theater that actually evokes change, as Matthew is saying, like that's what it is. That's what, or at least that's one way that it can take form. And so, yeah, I think that you know, it's just something to consider as we come back. But I also still believe that there's a place for theater of all kinds, and I'm not advocating for the jukebox musicals because that's not my speed either. But I think that in the same way that, like, as Matthew was talking about, you know, Shakespeare didn't write a plague play, but he does refer to it. I think that there are ways for us to. I think that this has to do with how we write to all audiences, you know, because like, I don't know, I saw a Second City show a couple of years ago that was very political, and Second City has been around for a long time and it has this identity of being political humor. But basically, I didn't find the show that funny, and basically felt like it was all of my own opinions being shouted at me, and that doesn't seem to get anywhere, because if those aren't my opinions, I'm not going to accept them, right? I'm going to shut down. And if those are my opinions, then like, what is the point of me going to that show? You know, nothing's being illuminated. So
right. Yeah. So Delora and Kevin want to add something on this discussion of who the talking across and to do new audiences. Is our voice relevant in this discussion? It's a 2-year, we're just talking about the incubation period. Do you have other thoughts, you two?
About audience?
Well, I heard that, who are we writing for in the end, in 2 years, when we're all allowed back in the theater? Has the audience that we're talking to changed, or should it change, or should we try to reach out in our audiences? And because with this social upheaval kind of world, who do we speak to when we come out of it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, theater has been quote unquote dying my entire lifetime. That's been, you know, was a lyric line that I grew up hearing. You know, the theater is dying, the theater is practically dead. So we've always had to worry about who is the audience for theater because of how much theater costs to produce and how much a theater ticket is. And I mean, I think about that every time I write a play, about who would be interested in seeing this play, but also what am I trying to say to the audience? You know, I mean, as playwrights, we have this unique, I think, platform that we get to say things to an audience. And so I don't know how my audience will change. I always think of my audience very broadly. I mean, you know, very, very, very broadly. So coming from my own background, which is a mix of things, that's how I think of my audience too. So for me, the audience isn't going to change. Will theaters change? You know, that's, I think, is a question that if theaters are going to appeal more to different audiences than they have, some theaters have anyway, then that would be a good change, to try and have more diversity in audience, more diversity in programming.
So let's, historically, having done a little of that research, after pandemics, after these huge upheavals, theater and society usually have gone back to where they were before, kind of with a vengeance, because they want to forget what's just happened and they want to move forward. This may be different. That may just be about the flus that have happened. It changed with AIDS. I think it had a fundamental change. It took a while to change, that we started to reflect back on ourselves. I mean, the 80s is, I think, one of the most pivotal times in theater history, because we started it's after that we realized that we needed to look to our community and take care of each other. And it started this revolution of ever since, the idea that theater is about connecting to our community and identity and all of those things that we are now living through. So I'm not sure you'd agree with that, Matthew, but I think it being a pivotal moment in our life, in our theater life, the 80s.
I have to unmute myself. I think absolutely. I think that and part of that is because the 80s was this meeting point, this merging of this movement surrounding health and this movement surrounding identity, right? And so the identity, the LGBTQ identity, if we're being generous, and if we're being more honest, it was a movement that put the gay male identity was what was featured most in the theater, right? Which is one of the which is a good thing, and it's also looking back and saying, well, it was that was
has to start someplace, and it snowballed. I think. I mean, it's the starting point.
It was a particular moment. It was imperfect, but it was incredibly necessary, and because the gay rights movement grew out of this moment in history and the LGBTQ rights more broadly, you wound up having theater forever changed, right? Because you had more and more voices. I think that there's a very important identity empowerment moment in the 80s. I think we're going to have an identity empowerment moment now. I think it's not going to be linked directly to COVID. I think that's one of the forces, but we have this huge reckoning in the country surrounding race, and then I think it opens beyond that, like as Laura was saying, to gender, right? But right now, I think we're having this huge reckoning.
That's kind of been kind of incubated because everyone's at home, right? And they aren't driven towards something. I mean, a lot of us don't have jobs and all these, so it's had this kind of particular kind of, what is that called? That little petri dish kind of thing, incubator part of.
I mean, also some of the charade of everyday life. I mean, our routine provides a charade, right? It's theater. Our routine is theater, and it's a charade, and it hides the fact that the world is not that charade, and it's not that routine, and it's not that life. And now that we don't have that charade and that routine and that life, we're just sitting down with our thoughts, and people are saying some really eye-opening things of all varieties, I think that's leading us to realize, my gosh, this is a moment, and it's not going to pass. It's going to change things.
I'll interject here real briefly and say I think we'd be remiss to fail to mention the importance of sports in American culture, and how that, having gone away, creates this incredible void of energy, and that energy needs to go somewhere. Just worth noting.
Right. That's another part. I mean, I'm not that into sports, but it has been a void of energy. It's really, people have passively allowed their energy to be hoarded by sports. And there's this like impatience. They're at home. So that's a good point, Kevin.
Well, there's a lack of catharsis. Sports is just ready-made catharsis. And that's one thing that theater is very good at offering, but the catharsis that theater offers, I think, is a little more permanent.
Yeah, and long lasting. That's true.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say, unless you have, I have this one last literary question about the future, just does this cause you to look at the future? Does it cause you to wonder about the future? And is the future a changed and more beautiful thing? If we're right here, right now, struggling as we are, could it be, when you think about the future, do you imagine, could it be the end of capitalism, the beginning of a more racially just place, the beginning of new advances in medicine for all? Have you been thinking about really beyond 2 and 5 years? Have you been thinking that this change could create something beautiful or horrid? And if it hasn't, then you don't have to answer, but do you imagine a different place? Mm. Mm.
There's a saying among historians that historians are only reasonably good at predicting the past, and not very good at predicting the future. I don't know that anybody. Yeah.
I guess I'm asking, do you see it? Do you see that this great moment that we have is do we look, is it a positive thing, or is it only going to lead to more and more division?
I mean, I'll answer first and say that I think that, well, first of all, I think those are two separate questions. First of all, I think it's a positive thing, right? I think it's a positive thing because it is opening our eyes to how negative things have been, right? And it is a period of disruption. And that is uncomfortable for all sorts of people, right? For everybody, it's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. And so I think that things are going to be better when we recognize the fact that although we think things were okay before, sometimes they actually were not. They were terrible. And so now when we realize that, then we see that this period of disruption, this lurch that we feel, has to propel us to someplace different. The question is, how long will that be? And how flexible are we as a society to change? And what we're seeing right now is that, I mean, I think the biggest transformation is this realization that a society that we thought was a lot more flexible and progressive as a whole actually shows remarkable inflexibility, levels of inflexibility that we thought were things of the past. And it's that inflexibility that we have to figure out what to do with as writers. That's what I'm talking about. How do we write to that inflexibility? How do we make it more flexible? And how long does that take? Will it happen in our lifetime? Will it happen, in a generation or two? I don't know. But I do think that we are moving towards someplace better because we can't move toward the past.
Okay. So that was great. Thank you. That was a good wrap up. Can I just move before we finish? It's about time to finish. I wanted to just move to some Zoom oriented questions. You guys were so wonderful to let Spooky Action experiment with your beautiful plays, knowing that we didn't know a lot about it. So we thank you for that. So and knowing that we were not, we didn't understand, there were all sorts of technical things that we kept learning and getting better at over the course of these first 4 plays. One thing we did learn is that we're going to probably videotape them, edit them, and then stream them. I think that we've all come to that consensus that that's a good idea. But are there aspects of this Zoom process that you found useful? Did watching it in 2D, did it inform you about your 3D play? Can you talk about, it says anything you noticed it struck you for the first time? Just can you give us feedback as to this 2D's play reading experiment?
I'll go first. Gillian, as you know, I wasn't too sure I wanted to have one.
Right, you and I talked about that. Yep.
Yes, and I was like, if the choice is a live reading or Zoom reading, hey, live reading, see you in the fall. That sounds good if that's an option, So I want to say I was wrong, Gillian, and I got I got a lot out of it. And my fear was, I have this. I mean, for those of you who didn't see it, I'm going to assume no one saw it, maybe, but because I've only seen one play of this group, and I apologize to the other 2 people whose play I did not see. I didn't see Matthew's or Jack's. I'm sorry. Maybe I can get a secret link and see it sometime from you. But mine it's a 2-person, very athletic combat play. I mean, really one of the more athletic plays I've written. Okay, so, and I had seen it in production last year at Alter Theater. So, and they did a beautiful job of it. So for me, I was kind of like, oh my gosh, how are they going to do this? But it really focused on the language for me.
Mm-hmm.
It made me really focus on the bare bones of it's a very complex plot, but it made me focus on the bare bones of it again. And Spooky Action, you guys reacquainted me with my play. I really appreciate that.
Great. Well, you and I had talked about what could you get out of this process. You know, you can't restage it. So we talked about, as the playwright and here's your director, we should have goals. And so one was to talk, we said, well, we want to know about those emotional turning points and let's focus on those. So that's what we tried to do. And you found that useful.
Very useful. And I mean, Kate and Jonathan and Lisa just did an incredible job. I mean, I can't tell you, so many people have texted or written me about how fantastic it was. And it was you guys. I mean, not about my work per se, but I mean, that too sometimes, but I mean, more about the job you guys did with it. And one person said to me, he's a director here in town, I'm in LA, and he said it was watching his first Zoom reading, and he said it was more like a production to him than he ever would have thought it would have been.
Oh, nice.
And he said, this can't count as a reading. This has to count as somewhere in between, which was a testimony to how you guys did it. But all this to say, it was very, very useful. Made me think about plot, character, made me think about the language. I really heard the language. And so that really helped me. And the way you guys with the setting too was very helpful. To change the setting like that, is specifically for my show. Really,
your show was really important because it was never really clear that you go back and forth so many times to these different places. So it was good to have a visual background, fairly neutral, not in a room, like just kind of panoramas. I felt I'm glad that you liked that. That helped.
Oh, I loved it. Anyway, I just wanted to say thank you to Spooky Action. You guys really helped me, and you changed my mind completely about the value of a Zoom reading in developing a play.
Yay! So, we also learned that it takes more hours, and it's more like a workshop in a way. There's so many elements that we have to think about in order to present a Zoom reading that's going to look good enough and be useful. But let's ask Kevin about. Was there something useful? And
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I spoke to it a little bit earlier. I got an awful lot out of it. My first ever Zoom reading, I'll echo what was said just now about it living somewhere between a reading, a workshop, and a production. Mine felt pretty fully realized in a funky way. I think we could have taken another couple of weeks and turned it into some, and shaved some of the script, made some changes, and could have really done something fun. My script is, for those who didn't see it, is about two social media content moderators losing their minds at work as they kind of compete with one another for status. It's a two-hander. And one of the central themes of the play is alienation in tech. It sounds like a bit of a cliche, right? But I think on stage, it has the potential to have like kind of a natural irony. Because they're going to be there. So it did inspire me to think an awful lot about what it would look like if it was more fully realized in terms of the Zoom production. What if we did edit it? What if we did do some, like a director, and a designer? We could do so many fun and wild things. Like there could be little interstitial, almost subliminal little flashes of things. I mean, there's so much we could do on that.
Yeah. You could find all that techie things. Yeah, it was clear that, it could sit in a mise en scène that is all kind of tech talking to each other in its own little way. So good. Thank you. I'm glad that you got something out of that. Now, Jack,
thanks very much.
You're welcome. Jack, we did neutral backgrounds. You go between the netherworld or the other world and this world and computer games. So I think we decided to do neutral backgrounds for you add sound as a cue to let us know where we were. And so what was useful in your development of this play in this format, if it was?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it was useful, very much. Just, I mean, it's always useful just to hear actors speaking the words out loud, whether in person or not. That is very useful. I think some of the things that I found that were difficult with this play in particular were like, I think that there's bits of my play that just like the rhythm of language and stuff is tricky, and so having it like there's always like a little bit of a delay, like there's a little bit of immediacy lost, in between people who are at separate computers, and so that is just something that has to be accepted. And similarly with like the sounds, because like I realized how much in my internal ear, I heard the sounds and like the dialogue just like coming right on top of each other, but all that said, hearing the actors say the words and actually hearing the sounds that Bob designed were great, because just hearing the sounds that he designed, at the very least, I was like, okay, so like this is what I've been hearing in my head. How is that interpreted by a sound designer? And it came out the way that I wanted it to, which was great in a lot of cases. I think one of the interesting observations that I made about it is that, again, sort of making the comparison or the switch from theater to television or film. Theater is such a occupies more space, right? And so the thing about the Zoom reading is like we're on close up on every single actor. Every single actor is in close up, and so that causes a lot more subtlety to be broadcasted at a much higher amplitude, right? And also things that, I think to a certain level, there are some things that might be too big to be seen in close up, in terms of like emotional content and stuff like that.
Yeah,
but it's
learning how to face act, face act subtly, but still with impact, was certainly something we also looked at.
I think that my actors did a really good job of adapting to that situation of the screen and still employing physicality and stuff. But it did actually illuminate to me something that I think I've always kind of known in the back of my head, which is that I do write for subtlety. Like I do tend to write, with a lot of nuance and stuff, and understated dialogue and everything. So in that sense, like that parts of the close-up element of the reading actually really worked and helped to really spotlight that aspect of my writing for me.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Now, Matthew, we've had by far the most theatrical of the plays, and we experimented the most. And we did a lot of backgrounds and green screens and didn't quite understand the capabilities of those. But it was nice to try to, your play is so inherently theatrical. So we were trying to experiment with what we could do to translate that. So what did you learn? What worked and what didn't, and the future of Zoom? And just talk to me a little bit about your experience.
Yeah, well, my hat's off it was an epic undertaking. It was a 6-person, I think 6 people, I've lost track. It's a 6-person play it involves elements of dance and movement, and the composition of the stage is so important for the play. In fact, it is written with parallel scenes and things moving into one another. The entire thing is orchestrated as a clash between the classics and the modern. There are these gods, and everything is just clashing, and there's a significant non-naturalistic component, right? There's a huge thread that's going through it that is non-naturalistic. And so all of those things, right? I mean, it was absolutely phenomenal to see this, like, how would this be presented in a Zoom world? I mean, my hats off to the cast and
to you for letting us do it.
Of course, it was, and I did learn things. I mean, there are certain things it's very difficult walking away from because you really have to be careful in editing after a Zoom call, because there are certain things that you're going to learn that are really relevant if you're going to adapt a piece into a Zoom call. We Victorians Zoom play. We Victorians will never be a Zoom play, right? No. And it's not even a play that I would adapt into a screenplay, right?
Right.
It's not. It exists.
No, it exists in the theater.
On a stage, yeah, and so what walking away from it is it was useful. You gather information about dialogue and character that you can use. You just always have to counterbalance that against how much of that will be addressed through the spectacle and the staging and the composition and the theater.
Right.
So that's sort of the alchemy that I'm working through now is, what do I change and how much do I entrust in the hands of the stage production? So we'll see.
Yeah. So thank you. And thank you. So it's our hour has come to an end, and it's been such a great conversation. I so appreciate all of you taking your time on Sunday and talking to each other and talking to people who are watching and thinking about the future and our play and what we're doing as playwrights. So I'm going to bring Richard back on, I hope. And there he is. And really, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, I want to add my thanks, especially because when we started this, we didn't know what we were doing. We hadn't a clue. It was all a great experiment, and we learned so much. Thank you to our playwrights for letting us use your work to boost us into this new world. I think we've discovered that we want to go farther. We talked about the idea of recording and editing, being more sophisticated in the use of the tools that are available for an online production. And one of the simple things is in Zoom, you can't hear two sounds at the same time. So going way beyond that, I think we're going to, continue experimenting. The hard truth is that, at least for our theater, I really can't imagine meeting all of the requirements to have audience in the theater safe, actors safe, until a year from this fall. It's going to be that long. And I really want to keep theater alive, keep making theater. And Zoom is not theater. The two dimensions is not theater. The empathy that we get from theater is just not there. But we can experiment and do a lot of really interesting things that will whet people's appetite for coming back. So that's my goal. And thank you so much for being part of this process. Bravo.
Thank you.
So till next time.